What if somewhere, buried beneath the stone flagstones of an old European square, a whisper still lives? Not a voice, not a scream, but a residue, a kind of weight in the air, a memory the earth never asked to carry. They say the Iron Maiden wasn't real, that it was a fiction, born of Victorian imaginations eager to see the past as darker than the present. And maybe that's true. Maybe the device never drank blood, never closed its iron lips on flesh. Maybe it was a ghost the moment it was born. But what if the pain that inspired it was older than iron? What if the shape, the coffin with nails, the gaze of the torturer, was drawn from something far deeper, far stranger than medieval cruelty? What if it was shaped not by fact, but by the slow sediment of cultural memory, the kind that forms not in decades, but in eras? The earth has its own way of recording pain, not in ink, but in strata, in the dark layers of charcoal buried deep below cities, in sudden shifts in the calcium of bones pulled from forgotten pits, in the isotopes left behind when bodies burn too hot, too fast, too long. Pain leaves fingerprints, not loud ones, but lasting. There are dungeons that no longer have names, cells where light has not touched stone in 500 years. Their walls weep salts. Their floors still breathe dampness from the graves beneath. No tourists walk there. No plaques are placed. But the silence feels arranged, as if something waits, still holding its breath. And above them, stone towers lean slightly eastward, worn not by war, but by wind. Centuries of breeze moving through arrow slits, brushing across rusted hinges, scattering particles of rust into mortar. We think torture is sudden, but the earth shows us it can be slow, too. Erosive, soft, unrelenting. We ask if the Iron Maiden was real. But perhaps the better question is, did she need to be? The image itself, the cruel elegance, the imagined sound of the door closing, has etched itself deeper than most facts ever manage. Deeper than names, deeper than dates. She is remembered not because she existed, but because she could have. And if the idea is older than the object, if the fear is older than the name, then maybe the earth isn't holding on to history. Maybe it's holding on to feeling, the kind that lingers, even when the buildings fall, even when the bones are dust, the kind that never needed to be written down to survive. And if that's true, what else might still be hiding beneath our feet, too quiet to scream, too real to die? Maybe we begin not with the Iron Maiden, but with the iron itself, the buried rust of stars, fallen through eons into the lungs of the earth. Iron is not born here. It arrives in the hearts of dying suns, in the final breath of collapsing giants. And when those stars end, they scatter. Dust, ash, splinters of ancient fire. Some of it lands here, slow, unseen, sifted into sediment, folded into soil. And the planet drinks it. There are rivers that once ran red, not with blood, but with oxidized time. Iron-rich currents flowing through wetlands and deltas long before the first temple, the first forge, the first name. The earth was always preparing. Long before there was cruelty, there was chemistry. Long before weapons, there was weather. Iron didn't wait for us. It seeped into everything, into bone, into bark, into breath. In the marrow of our ancestors, there is rust. In their graves, faint magnetic signatures still hum beneath layers of clay. What if the Iron Maiden was never a creation, but a culmination? A shape dreamt slowly over eons. A suggestion whispered by geology into culture. Sharp edges are not new. Teeth came first. Claws. Splinters of volcanic glass. But iron changed something. It made permanence out of violence. It made memory metallic. In bogs and burial pits, archaeologists have found blades placed not for use, but for ritual, their edges dulled by intention, their forms still singing the shape of harm. And deeper still, iron nodules curled like sleeping animals in pockets of ancient sediment, waiting, not because they think, but because the planet does. Because maybe the earth knows how to offer us what we are already reaching toward. And so the Iron Maiden, in her imagined cruelty, might not be a device at all. She might be a mirror, a reflection of something geological, not just psychological. Not born in the Middle Ages, but born in the red dust of planetary history. Not because someone designed her, but because the earth had already drawn her lines, long before we found a name. If we are shaped by the ground we walk on, if our fears are fed by the metals in our blood, then perhaps the tools of our horror are less invention and more inheritance. The cradle was beneath us all along, laced with rust, ringed with silence, waiting. And if the tools came before the hands, what else might the earth be holding for us, quietly, in the layers we have not yet disturbed? Perhaps the first place we should look is not the ground beneath our feet, but the paper shelves we rarely open. The archives, the footnotes, the forgotten margins of history where fiction and fact drift close enough to blur. The Iron Maiden, as we know her, iron shell, spiked interior, cruel elegance, first emerges not in the Middle Ages, but much later. In the dust-hushed corridors of 19th-century museums, in catalogs and collections curated not by torturers, but by antiquarians. It was not a weapon of war, but a display, a ghost arranged in glass. The whisper of horror given shape for a curious public, centuries after the blood would have dried. In 1793, a story surfaces in Nuremberg, a tale of a woman sentenced to die by a device too perfectly cruel, too intricately wicked, to be true. There is no record before, no drawing, no diagram. Only this, a retelling. Not because it happened, but because someone said it had. And once the idea is spoken, it lingers, latches, builds rust in the imagination. Could it be that the Iron Maiden was never meant to deceive, but to conjure? An embodiment of medieval fear crafted by modern hands. A shape born not from evidence, but from longing, the kind of longing that history sometimes breeds. Not for truth, but for spectacle. For something to explain the ache of an unknowable past. A reliquary not for saints, but for the silence of centuries. Inside the archives, you can find the pattern. How myths fossilize. One misattributed quote becomes a citation. One sketch becomes a photograph. One replica becomes the original. And the more we repeat the story, the deeper it roots. Until even scholars forget which part was imagined first. Like geological layers, compressing belief into sediment year by year. And yet, even knowing this, the Iron Maiden feels old. Too old. Like a memory that predates the page. Like something we didn't invent, but remembered. Perhaps there was never one real maiden. But maybe there were many shadows, rituals lost, devices unnamed, pain unrecorded. Maybe the idea comes from those absences. The missing pages. The gaps where the archive goes quiet. And if history can whisper a lie until it sounds like truth, how many more shadows might be hiding between the lines, waiting for us to believe them into being? Perhaps pain itself is older than story. Perhaps cruelty was never invented, only observed, inherited like fire, passed not through reason but through ritual. Before language, before parchment, before even myths, there were gestures. There were warnings. There were wounds left on walls. On ancient stone panels pulled from the dust of Nineveh, we see kings and captives locked in eternal choreography. Carvings that stretch for meters, detailing the process of breaking a body as though it were a sacred rite. Not because they wanted to forget, but because they wanted to remember. Or perhaps, because they wanted you to remember. Spectacle, not secrecy. Power, not privacy. In these reliefs, cruelty becomes communication, a slow script etched in muscle and bone. And then we drift forward, past sand and century, into cathedrals whose basements echo with damp breath. Medieval dungeons carved not by erosion, but by intent. Cells where light never touched. Walls where rust bloomed like lichen. And still, the markings appear, scratches, gouges, smooth symbols no longer legible, yet deeply felt. As though stone could absorb fear. As though agony, when repeated enough, might fossilize. What if pain was not an accident of evolution, but a tool, sharpened over time not just to wound, but to speak? A theater of nerves, nerves as ink. The Iron Maiden, whether real or not, fits this language. Too elaborate to be private, too poetic to be practical. She belongs to the psychology of watching, of performance. A stage set for those who did not bleed, but believed. What mattered wasn't the act, but the imagining. And maybe that's why she endures, not because she existed, but because we understood her. As if something in the human animal has always known how to turn suffering into symbol. From Assyrian kings to inquisitorial courts to the modern museum display. Pain is placed behind glass, again and again, and we lean in. Not because we're cruel, but because the memory is ours. Collective. Inherited. A language older than blood. The first ink was not red. It was stone dust. It was groove and shadow. It was breath held in silence while the wall was marked. And somewhere in that silence, a question lingers, not about what happened, but why we still remember the shape of it. And if memory is carved more deeply by fear than by fact, what else have we carried forward, never knowing where we learned to look away? In a hushed museum corridor, behind softly polished glass, she waits. Iron doors curved inward like a prayer gone wrong. Nails arranged not for utility, but for imagination. She is still. She is hollow. And yet, she is watching. The Iron Maiden, or what we call her, was likely never built to bleed. Her wooden frame is too thin, her spikes too wide, her joints too staged. Historians whisper this now with a gentle certainty, as if trying not to wake something. She was crafted not by torturers, but by collectors, not to end life, but to stir it, in the stomach, in the chest, in the quiet places where we keep disbelief. And still, we remember her, as if she had walked through the centuries, read with myth, untouched by revision. She appears in children's books, horror films, carnival rides, a silhouette as famous as it is false. Not because we want her to be real, but because we need her to be possible. She makes sense of cruelty by giving it shape. She answers the question we're too afraid to ask. How far could it go? Wood can lie. So can iron. But silence cannot. And in the rooms where replicas stand, grand halls in London, in Vienna, in Nuremberg, the silence is thick. Not with reverence, but with performance. Visitors step close. They photograph. They read the placard and whisper to one another. Was this really used? The answer is almost always no. And yet the question returns, over and over, like a ritual, like a kind of prayer. Is it possible that we are not haunted by what happened, but by what could have? That the fiction we built is more durable than the truth we buried? Maybe, maybe not. But the Iron Maiden endures, not because she killed, but because she tells a story that fits. She satisfies something ancient, a hunger for structure in the chaos of pain. And if the lie is beautiful in its symmetry, in its terror, in its silence, does it matter that no blood ever dried on her lips? Or is it enough that we keep looking again and again, as if we're waiting for the doors to close? In the softly lit exhibition halls of the 19th century, history became performance. Cabinets of curiosity multiplied into rooms, and rooms into museums, each one curated like a theater of shadows. Behind red velvet ropes and smoky glass, the Middle Ages were reassembled from fragments, half-truths, and imagination. It was an age in love with illusion, with dusted relics, with the aesthetic of terror, with the thrill of proximity to something that once might have screamed. Collectors traveled not for facts, but for feeling. A spike chair purchased from a forgotten castle. A scold's bridle dredged from a moldy cellar. A coffin-shaped cabinet dressed in rust. Many were fakes. Others were recreations, not reproductions of artifacts, but of ideas. Crafted by blacksmiths under commission, aged with vinegar and ash, placed beneath dim lights to catch the eye of a public who didn't want history, but story. Story that bites. Story that bleeds. And still, the rooms felt heavy. Even when the items were false, the weight was not. There is something strange that happens when enough people believe something once lived. It takes on mass. Presence. A kind of ghosthood. When you walk through those museums, in Vienna, in Paris, in the cryptic corners of Prague, you feel it. That hush. That waiting. That sense that maybe, just maybe, you're in the presence of pain that never quite happened, but insists on being remembered anyway. Maybe the Iron Maiden wasn't made for torture, but for tourism. A piece of performance architecture. Not meant to scream, but to shudder. A reminder not of what was, but of what we fear was possible. And the fear is real. Palms sweat. Breathing slows. Children pull closer to their parents. It's as if we're rehearsing, preparing for some ancient echo to find us again. There's a term used in geology, pseudofossil. Shapes that look like ancient organisms, but are born from minerals, from pressure, from accident. A fern etched in stone that never lived. A spiral that mimics life, but holds no cell, no breath. Could it be that museums are filled with historical pseudofossils, truths made of suggestion, not sediment? And if so, does that make them less meaningful? Or more? Because fear, like sediment, accumulates, layer by layer, gaze by gaze. And when enough eyes have lingered on a lie, the lie begins to leave an imprint. And when the lights go out, and the room is empty again, perhaps the silence is no longer just imagined. And if the things we make up in order to feel have begun to feel real, how much of history, then, is already dreaming? The Iron Maiden, with her iron grin and wooden bones, may never have tasted breath, but the world that shaped her did. A world thick with ash and quiet firelight. Not the fire of hearth or warmth, but of verdict, of ritual unmaking. A flame drawn not to illuminate, but to consume. We step back now, into the cold stone plazas where heretics were marched, barefoot, silent, toward the stake. The air smelled not of incense, but of fat and damp wood. And when the crowds gathered, they did not scream. They watched. Some prayed. Some wept. Others simply listened. The slow burn of justice was a sound the century came to know. And still, the ground remembers. Not with monuments, but with a darkening beneath the soil. Pockets where chemistry changed, where carbon soot fused with bone, where time still exhales heat in silence. The oubliette, the forgotten place. A pit beneath the castle floor. Not designed to kill, but to erase. No torture device was more complete than the absence of record. No punishment deeper than to vanish without sound. And it happened. Again and again. Not with flair, but with structure. The dungeon was not a mistake. It was an architecture of forgetting. And above it, life continued. Horses walked. Markets bustled. The earth turned. Maybe that's where she came from, the Iron Maiden. Not from one chamber, but from many. Not from one execution, but from the accumulation of extinguished names. She was shaped in the forges of fear and memory, born of centuries where the line between justice and spectacle blurred like smoke. Her myth condensed from real pain, real flame, real silence. Even now, in the archives of Inquisition courts, names appear briefly in ink, and then stop. A confession signed, a verdict rendered, and then, nothing. Where did they go? How were they held? What did they see in the dark? These are not questions the documents answer, but the gaps say enough. What's missing may be the most honest part. And so we walk through history like a field of scattered ashes. Some cooled, some still warm. The Iron Maiden may not have burned anyone, but others did. Thousands. And from that fire, the myth rises. Because myths need fuel, and there has always been fuel. Paper, flesh, fear, the names that no one spoke again. And if we could gather every lost voice, every vanished breath, would her shape still feel fictional? Or would she feel inevitable? Down beneath the floors of stone cathedrals and ancestral halls, beneath the timber stairs and rusted hinges, the ground itself tells stories no parchment ever recorded. Not stories of kings or verdicts or scripture, but stories written by fluids, by minerals, by time. Stories not told in words, but in stains. The geology of punishment begins quietly. A body kept too long in damp confinement changes its space. Skin softens. Walls sweat. Chains leave rings on the floor like melted crowns. The air thickens with salt and ammonia. Every tear, every breath, every drop of blood, they do not vanish. They seep, and the stone receives it. Not eagerly, but faithfully. Absorbing sorrow the way sandstone drinks the sea. Slowly, without question. In the limestone foundations of medieval fortresses, we sometimes find blackened corridors. Not from soot or fire, but from iron, rust bleeding into rock, year after year, hinge by hinge, cuff by cuff. Iron decays, but it never disappears. It diffuses, a chemical inheritance, and within it, a whisper of violence, one we can't unmake. Even now, centuries later, those same walls bloom faintly with oxidation, a red ghost rising from the mortar. Geologists speak of diagenesis, the transformation of sediments after burial. Layers compress, molecules shift, minerals migrate, and in prisons carved from bedrock, something similar may occur. Not to the stone, but to memory. Pain becomes particulate. The echoes of suffering rearrange the strata, like trauma subducted into silence. What if cruelty isn't just an act, but a pressure? What if it presses into the landscape, a human tectonic force, invisible yet dense, deforming more than flesh, more than policy, deforming the ground itself? Could pain cause erosion, not of cliffs, but of conscience? Could places grieve? In some cloisters, in some abbey basements, you can find fossilized blood, not in puddles, but in dust, iron-rich, deep red, almost invisible unless you know where to look. A fingerprint on the floor of time, and near it, always, stone that's different, rougher, wetter, as if it breathes more slowly than the rest, as if it remembers. And maybe that's all the Iron Maiden ever was, not an artifact, but an echo, a dream shaped by the terrain it grew from. Because when a place holds enough hurt, when walls absorb enough history, something shifts. A silence forms that feels shaped, sculpted, heavy. And if we walk those same corridors, barefoot and alone, would we hear it too? The soft mineral memory, the sorrow seeping from beneath the flagstones, the whisper of stone that once held breath too long and still hasn't let it go. Entropy does not forget. It unfolds, gently, constantly, like the slow breath of time itself, where we imagine endings, sharp, final, sealed. The universe knows only drifting, unraveling. Bodies are not buried so much as surrendered, first to the air, then to the earth, then to the scatter of memory, and finally, to the slow mathematics of loss. What decays tells us everything. The speed, the shape, the texture of a death. A bone gnawed by roots. A collar clasp turned green by oxidized tears. The trace of skin on linen so fragile it falls apart if you name it too loudly. These are not just remains. They are records, but records written in entropy's hand, uneven, smudged, dissolved at the edges. They don't tell the whole story. They can't, but they hum with what once was. In crypts long sealed, we find hands curled not in pain, but in waiting, teeth clenched around names no one wrote down. Isotopes in the marrow drift from their original ratios, whispering the passage of years in a language made of half-lives. Even the metal rusts differently in the presence of grief. Corrosion that pools near the sternum. Iron rings worn soft at the finger where a lover once wept. Entropy doesn't erase. It rearranges. It slows. It disguises. But it never truly forgets. In peat bogs and ice caves, in ossuaries and sunken cathedrals, it preserves just enough to haunt, just enough to ask, was this a body or a message? A person or a pause in the silence? Perhaps that's why the Iron Maiden haunts us, even if she never held a body, because she could have. And in the endless game of entropy, possibility decays too, not as rot, but as repetition. The imagined scene, played over and over in the museum of the mind, until it begins to corrode the boundary between myth and memory, between invention and impact. What's left behind is never neutral. Decay reveals more than it conceals. It shows where the pain lingered longest. It shows what refused to vanish. And in the long shadows of the Iron Maiden story, we find those details. The ones that rust. The ones that cling. The ones that do not ask to be believed, only noticed. And if entropy keeps such careful records of what breaks, might it also remember the shape of a scream that never happened, but should have? Not a real scream, but a remembered one, constructed, rehearsed, passed from mind to mind like a relic made of thought. There are things the earth preserves in stone, and there are things it preserves in us. Not because they were true, but because we kept repeating them. Maybe that's what the Iron Maiden has become, not a device, but a memory with no origin. A fossil not of matter, but of fear. Technofossils are the residues of us, the plastics, the alloys, the pigments that will outlast our cities. But not all fossils are buried. Some are carved into collective imagination, not because they existed, but because we made space for them. The Iron Maiden may never have held a body, but she holds a place in the mind. And like plastic, that place refuses to rot. Could it be that this imagined object is more enduring than a real one would have been? Metal corrodes. Wood collapses. But a symbol repeats. It echoes. And in that echo, it grows stronger. The cavity of her form is not only physical, but psychological, a hollow into which we pour every unspoken question about pain, power, and performance. We keep her alive not with evidence, but with belief. Fossils are not simply bones. They are traces, the imprint of a footstep, the void left by a shell, the mineral ghost of an absence. And so too is she, a shape in history where something might have been, a cavity mistaken for a presence. We mistake outlines for objects, grooves for truth. But nature does this too. In paleontology, there is a word, steinkern, a stone cast formed inside a hollow shell, preserving the internal space of something now gone. The Iron Maiden may be our cultural steinkern, a story hardened into form where history was once soft. We didn't need to find her. We needed to imagine her. Maybe we always will. Because the story she tells, of slow cruelty, of perfect design in the service of pain, scratches at a deeper layer in us. Not because we love it, but because we fear it. Because we recognize its contour in places we don't speak of. Maybe she was never built because she didn't need to be. She already existed, hidden in the cavity between what we endured and what we chose to remember. And if that cavity echoes still, long after the myth was named, long after the iron rusted away, how do we know we weren't the ones who answered her first? Perhaps it was never her voice we feared, but our own. Because in every room where the Iron Maiden has stood, replica or not, one thing has always remained the same. She faces us, and we, reflexively, face her, not in accusation, not in denial, but in wonder, in unease, in something that feels like remembering. She was not built to kill. Not really. That much we've come to accept. But the question she asks lingers anyway. Not what did they do with me, but what would you have done? Would you have watched? Would you have turned the crank? Or would you have stepped inside, quietly, as if fulfilling a role already written? The Iron Maiden is less a device and more a surface, one that gleams just enough to catch a shape. And the shape it catches is always us. Not screaming, not bleeding, just looking. Our eyes reflect in hers. Cold, curious. Still, we don't see the victim. We see the viewer. And that, somehow, feels worse. History doesn't blink. It doesn't move forward like we do. It waits. And when we lean in close to its glass, it offers not an answer, but a mirror. A place where our fascination becomes fossilized alongside our denial. We want to ask, who could have made such a thing? Who could have stood beside her and thought, yes, this is right? But the question has weight only if we are willing to admit that we already know. Because we have stood beside other things. Softer things. Quieter mechanisms of pain. And we have watched. Maybe she was never real because she didn't need to be. The mind of the viewer completed the shape. We imagine the hinges, the slow closing door, the blood that probably never fell. Not because we wanted horror, but because horror tells us something about the roles we refuse to name. The ones we play when no one is looking. The ones we inherit when history begins to repeat. And so, she stands not in the past, but in the present. Not as artifact, but as invitation. A frame we step into without realizing. And in that frame, we are asked nothing. Not to act, not to confess, only to look. And in looking, we make her real again. And if all she ever needed to exist was someone willing to believe she could, then maybe the real device was never the maiden. Maybe it was the mirror, the one we keep polishing, the one we still can't stop staring into. Even now, behind thick glass and motion sensors, she waits. The Iron Maiden, not cloaked in shadow, but in halogen light. Her hinges clean, her spikes dulled by time and caution. And every few days, a hand returns to wipe her face. A soft cloth, a gentle sweep. No reverence, no fear, just routine. The ritual of maintenance, as if history were a thing we could keep neat. There is no blood on her lips, only dust, the slow skin of years, shed and resettled. What gathers there is not the residue of crime, but of presence. Skin cells from the curious, the bored, the skeptical, the ones who leaned in just a little too close, breathing fog onto the glass, trying to see if anything remained of the myth. And all the while, the maiden stands in stillness. Not accused, not worshipped, preserved. But what does it mean to preserve something never real? Is it a lie? Or is it a need? The worst thing may not be that she was ever used, but that something in us still needs her to be. Not for violence, but for closure. A symbol so sharp it distracts us from the deeper dullness. The long, slow pain of human history repeating itself without the comfort of spikes or steel. We call her a relic, but relics are usually parts of saints. This is something different. A story so shaped, so simplified, that we can finally point to it and say, there, that's what we don't do anymore. And in that pointing, we feel safe. As if the darkness has borders. As if the past has been successfully fenced in behind plexiglass and captions. But glass doesn't erase. It only refracts. And the maiden, whether fake, real, or both, reflects something that doesn't quite go away. A hunger in the archive. A hush in the crowd. A cold fascination we still haven't outgrown. Not because we love cruelty, but because we fear how quietly it nests. In systems. In habits. In all the tiny ways pain is made acceptable when no doors slam shut. So we keep her clean. We keep her visible. We make sure she doesn't disappear. As if losing her would make us forget. As if forgetting her would make us do it all again. And if her lips are quiet now, if her iron skin gathers dust like a sleeping monument, maybe it's not her voice we're listening for anymore. Maybe it's ours. The sound of ourselves, whispering through glass, still unsure whether we've truly changed. But what if the glass is only part of the truth? What if, beneath the polished lies of display, there waits a darker sediment, not imagined, not arranged, but buried? In Nuremberg, there is a well that doesn't draw water. It draws stories, sealed now, tucked behind stone. But for a time, it opened into something deeper. An underground chamber lined in soot and silence. There, long before the replicas and reenactments, something was found. Fragments. Nothing whole. A curve of rusted metal. A hinge. A spike. Bent and smooth like it had been closed more times than it was opened. No inscription. No diagrams. Just iron, heavy with silence. It was catalogued, but barely. A footnote. A possibility. Mislabeled. Misfiled. Left to oxidize beneath archival dust. And yet, the shape lingers. The curve. The cavity. Not enough to claim, but too much to dismiss. Could it be that the story we thought was invented was only remembered imperfectly? That the fiction was rooted in something we had already forgotten? Sometimes archaeology doesn't unearth truth. It only stirs the dust around a question. Soil samples show disturbances older than the city itself, sediments broken, recompacted, sealed again. Something stood there. Something with weight. And the iron? Unusual. Not local. A blend used rarely in that region, in that century. Imported from the east. Brought with purpose. And left with none. In another corner of the city, a tomb mislabeled as a merchant's was opened during renovations. Inside, the bones were wrong. Not a single man, but several. Compressed. Arranged. As if packed not with honor, but necessity. Mixed among them, more iron. More curvature. More silence. The patterns don't declare, but they suggest. Maybe the Iron Maiden never lived exactly as we imagined her. But maybe something like her did. Not a spectacle. Not a punishment. But a prototype. An artifact made not for myth, but for memory. Or secrecy. Or fear. Something forgotten on purpose, because it was easier than remembering. Something hidden in stone so that the story could be rewritten more gently above. And if we found her, half-formed and rotting in the earth, would we know what we were looking at? Or would we, again, call it a lie? Because it felt safer than the truth? Maybe. But not because we don't believe. Maybe because we don't want to hear what comes next. Because real or imagined, the Iron Maiden is not quiet by design. She begs for sound. She demands it. The creak of the hinges. The snap of the clasp. The slow shift of breath inside a metal womb. These are the sounds we expect, even when we know they were never recorded. Even when the device itself was never truly used. We wait for the scream, and it never comes. Silence is not what we remember. Silence is what we forget to fear. Because silence hides nothing. It holds everything. Every echo not released. Every word that arrived too late. Every gasp that caught in the throat and turned back to bone. The Iron Maiden stands, not dripping with blood, but coated in quiet. And still, we lean closer. Still we listen. In medieval torture, pain was rarely private. It was a spectacle, a performance meant for ears and eyes. But the Iron Maiden, imagined or not, resists the stage. She closes. She swallows. She seals. Her punishment, if it ever existed, was internal, sound absorbed by iron, breath stolen before it could become voice. She is not cruel because she hurts. She is cruel because she mutes. That's the part we don't know what to do with. The quiet room. The lack of records. The whisper that ends too soon. Because sound affirms. A cry tells us that something happened. That someone was there. Silence only implies. An implication is worse. It lingers. It waits. Historians search for documents. For blueprints. For evidence of use. and they don't find it. But absence is not comfort. It is a corridor with no exit, a stone cell with no record of who last entered. And sometimes that silence feels arranged, too precise, too rehearsed. What if that's why the Iron Maiden remains in museums, behind glass? Not because we fear her noise, but because we fear her hush. She reminds us that not all horrors arrive with trumpets and ash. Some arrive quietly, some slip in without sound, and when they leave, they take the voice with them. And if the silence has lasted this long, if we've preserved the shape but forgotten the sound, is it because nothing happened? Or because too much did? Still she waits. The Iron Maiden. Not closed, not open, but paused, as if mid-breath. She stands in corners of museums not out of prominence, but permanence. Her presence has become part of the architecture. The room is shaped around her, lighting adjusted, temperature controlled. Not for her protection, but ours. She has no voice, no confirmed history, no evidence that she was ever used. And yet we visit her like a grave whose headstone was worn blank. We don't need the name. We know who rests there, or we think we do. That's the trick of myth. It doesn't require proof. Only shape, only suggestion. A cavity large enough to hold all our fears at once. And still she waits. Not for flesh, but for meaning, for projection, for the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, will walk past her and say, "Ah, yes, this explains it. This makes sense of the darkness. This is the thing we survived." Because some stories don't fade with time. They fossilize. They harden around us like sediment, compacted by repetition, stratified by belief. And as they age, they lose detail but gain power. They no longer need to be accurate. They only need to fit. Fit the silence. Fit the fear. Fit the shape of what we've left unsaid. Maybe we need her, not as proof of cruelty, but as a placeholder for it. As the vessel that lets us say, we don't do this anymore. As if pain were that tidy. As if horror could be boxed, displayed, named. She has become a kind of prayer, not to be answered, but to be repeated. A symbol not of violence, but of the distance we still keep from it. We stand before her, hearts still, voices low, and we think, this was the worst of it. And maybe that's why she stays. Because we need something worse. Something sharper. Something final. But she offers no closure. Only posture. Only waiting. And if she waits long enough, will we forget she was never real? Or will we remember she was never false, just unfinished? A myth not created, but inherited. Shaped by silence. Completed by belief. And if we walk away, if we leave her standing there in her quiet vigil, will we notice that we're the ones who closed the door?